yeah, as she mentioned, I'm currently a PhD student here at Utah State University on the main Logan campus. I'm going to be graduating in May, so this semester, and then I'm going to be transitioning to a job as an assistant professor here in the department. So continuing some of the stuff I've been working on with my graduate studies. Most of it's been related to hydroponics, mainly looking at nutritional aspects in liquid hydroponics and how we can create essentially the ideal types of fertilizers and nutrient solutions to feed our plants. So they're getting exactly what they need, but nothing extra. So nothing ends up going to waste. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit, give a little presentation here about what hydroponics is, some of the key parts of its interesting history, at least the stuff that I think is interesting. And then some examples from some things that I've done in my background with hydroponics. So let me get this shared here. All right, and we'll go full screen on this in a second. All right. So are you able to see the presentation screen, or are you seeing presenter view right now?
I'm seeing presenter view.
Okay, let me try and switch that.
Screen.
All right, how about now?
Money.
Perfect. Excellent. All right, so yeah, title of the presentation here is hydroponics, kind of year-round growing at any scale. So this here is an example of a plant that I grew in liquid hydroponics here at Utah State University. And I really love this picture because it kind of exemplifies one of the big benefits to growing hydroponically. So this is a cucumber plant. And you can see those beautiful white roots at the bottom of the plant there. That's one thing that is really difficult for us to analyze and research out in field soils or in field agriculture. Sure, we can try and dig up the roots the best that we can, but there's always going to be damage there. We're going to be kind of losing a lot of those finer roots. And it's not necessarily the case in hydroponics. We can not only monitor the root health and the growth of the roots throughout the entire production cycle of our plants, but we can analyze them at the end of the harvest cycle as well. They're completely clean in this case. In this case, it was grown in just a liquid culture solution, but a lot of the solid soilless medias that we use are really easily removed, and we can really use those to our benefit if we're interested in looking at roots and understanding how the root zone responds to different environmental conditions. So hydroponics, as a bit of a background, the word itself is kind of a combination of two Greek words, hydro for water, obviously, and then ponos, which essentially translates to labor. So hydroponics translates essentially to water labor or water working. So we're using the water, obviously, to grow the plants, but as the main driver to use as a transfer model, essentially, for nutrients. So the water is taking the nutrients and moving it from the solution or the substrate up into the plant. I really like this quote here, and I like to talk about it with any introduction with hydroponics. This quote is from a plant scientist back in the 70s. And he said that it's doubtful that any technique can control water, nutrient, and aeration status, as well as nutrient solution culture. And by nutrient solution culture, he meant hydroponics. So hydroponics was really developed for hundreds of years as a research tool. A lot of the things that we know about plant nutrition and plant physiology were figured out and determined using hydroponic principles. So there was no solid soils, and they were able to essentially control the exact amount of nutrients and the exact amount of water that their test plants were able to receive and get some really kind of interesting things. That's how we found out a lot of the essential elements for plants and also a lot of the basic physiologic principles. Photosynthesis, for example, was figured out using hydroponic plants. I can't talk about hydroponics without giving a nod to this gentleman. This is Dennis Hoagland. If you've ever done any type of research on hydroponic nutrient solutions or hydroponic in general, you've probably heard of Hoagland's solution. And this was developed by this gentleman, Dennis Hoagland. The first iteration was done in 1919 at UC Berkeley, out in Berkeley, California. And Berkeley is a lot where a lot of these hydroponics was really started to take it into the mainstream. These days, we don't necessarily think about Berkeley as a big ag school. We now think about UC Davis as the big ag school out there. But UC Davis kind of started as the agricultural experiment station for UC Berkeley. But now it's the main ag campus out there. But a lot of this original work was done at UC Berkeley right about 100 years ago right now. He published his nutrient solutions in what essentially was an extension bulletin, a little extension booklet called The Water Culture Method for Growing Plants Without Soil, written by Hoagland and then his student, Daniel Arnott. And multiple iterations over the years. This particular edition was published in 1950. But like I said, this is a very common nutrient solution that they developed, and a lot of people have kind of modified this to meet their own needs. This particular edition, in research circles, we talk about literature citations, and this has been cited over 21,000 times. So any type of researcher that's using hydroponics is probably using some type of Hoagland's solution. That's really kind of first type of mainstream nutrient solution that was developed for hydroponics. There was some back in the late 1800s that were developed, but they weren't quite as mainstream. And with this type of extension bulletin, Hoagland and UC Berkeley really started to get the word out and have examples for people that wanted to do this either in their own research or in their own businesses. And that was really one of the big things that they were trying to do. So up until this point, hydroponics was really just used as a research tool. People weren't doing this in their backyards. There was no really hobby industry. There was no commercial industry or anything like that. But these people and UC Berkeley in general saw this as an opportunity to turn this into kind of a niche form of agriculture. They wanted to essentially try and commercialize the system and be able to grow actual measurable quantities that could be sold for profit. So this is William Gerke here. You can see him on the left up on his stepladder tending to his hydroponic tomatoes. This was shortly after Dennis Hoagland in the early 1930s, also at UC Berkeley. And Gerke from Berkeley was tasked essentially by the university with trying to develop methods that could be promoted to other people that weren't necessarily researchers, but were commercial people that wanted to take this science and use it to produce vegetables or fruits or flowers or whatever. And he did a lot of work with all different kinds of crops. This picture here is him looking at some flowers that he had growing hydroponically, in this case, not in the greenhouse, but outdoors. And they were really kind of on a publicity tour, almost a press tour with these early versions of hydroponics. This quote comes from Popular Science Monthly in 1929, and they called it the greatest gift to agriculture since the science of fertilization of the soils was worked out. People were essentially convinced that this was a magic form of growing plants. We know now today that it's not necessarily magic, but it does work quite well to grow certain types of crops. And I'll preface this by saying I'm not necessarily on the soapbox of hydroponics as a replacement for field agriculture. I think it's a supplement to field agriculture. There's some crops that grow really good and are quite profitable in hydroponics, and a lot of other crops that are not necessarily profitable or probably will never be profitable in hydroponics. So I'm not trying to say this is a replacement, but more of a supplement and kind of a niche thing. The last part of the history here that I kind of want to talk about that's super interesting is that the U.S. Army actually got wind of hydroponic food production in the 1940s, so during World War II and kind of the tail end of World War II. They wanted to put a large hydroponic system on Ascension Island. So Ascension Island is this really small volcanic island kind of located midway between South America and Africa. And this was essentially a stopover place for the U.S. Army for travel from the Americas over to Africa. But being a volcanic island, there wasn't really very many good soils here for growing crops. And due to its isolation, shipping in fresh vegetables and fresh crops took quite a long time for them to get these crops to this island. So they wanted a system that could be used to grow fresh veggies for everyone stationed here on this island. These next couple of pictures I'm going to show you are taken from a National Geographic article written in 1945. And their tagline was that now vegetables flourish in ascension cinders by the magic of hydroponics. Cinders referring to essentially the volcanic soils that were there, but are essentially completely devoid of nutrients. So this is a fun picture that I'd like to show. It's taken an Ascension Island from that National Geographic article. We can see on the left there, they had hydroponics station #1 laboratory, and you can see them with some of their different types of vegetables there. And then on the right-hand side, you can see we got our GI there working with his plants and his, looks like might be cucumbers. And I love this one because he's got a cigarette in his mouth. So he's a classic 1940s soldier there. And then we have this picture here that kind of just shows the scale, really, of what they were doing here on Ascension Island. You can read that caption there, but they were doing this on quite the large scale. They actually had kind of teamed up and reached out to UC Berkeley to develop this system just on a massive scale here. They're showing a bunch of lettuce production in their shade tents, almost a little bit of controlled environment protection here. Right, this is kind of a tropical island out in the middle of the Atlantic, so they had a little bit of protection going on here for their crops. Which is a super cool old article here with some really neat pictures that were I found really interesting when I was looking at kind of the background of where hydroponics came from. So a couple of basically the standard types of hydroponic methods that I kind of want to touch on that you might hear about when you're looking at different types of hydroponic systems. This first one here is what we call deep water culture or DWC. It could also be called deep flow hydroponics. And essentially this is where we have giant ponds. These ponds aren't very deep, probably only 12 to 18 inches deep. And they are filled with a rich nutrient solution. And we have these styrofoam rafts floating on this nutrient solution. And we have little seedlings that are transplanted into these rafts. The rafts hold them in place, and then the roots kind of grow down through the rafts and contact the solution that is contained in the ponds. We can see we lift up these rafts and we got these nice, beautiful roots. This is a really common method of production for large kind of commercial scales, especially with leafy green production here. You can see these are quite the large ponds here. And these two pictures, we were growing lettuce. Lettuce is one of the most common types of crops grown in hydroponics, mainly because it grows super quickly and it's pretty forgiving plant to grow in hydroponics. So deep water culture here, deep water flow, a pretty common type of system for growing in hydroponics. The other type of system that's relatively common, pretty common here, is called a drip system or a Dutch bucket system. It's called a Dutch bucket system because it was developed by the Dutch in the Netherlands. They have quite a large both research program in the Netherlands that also a large kind of commercial scale hydroponic productions in the Netherlands. This picture here was actually taken from a greenhouse facility that I used to work on back in Wisconsin when I was in my high school and undergraduate years. These are cucumbers that are being grown hydroponically. So instead of being grown in liquid solution, like those previous couple pictures, these are now grown in a solid substrate, in a solid media. These are grown in pure perlite. So perlite is a volcanic substance. It's kind of that white, foamy, speckly stuff that you would find in normal types of potting media. So if you get potting soil at the store, and you see those white kind of foam parts in there, that's perlite. Our stuff was grown in 100% perlite. Excuse me for just one moment here. Abby, I think that's a tour. Can you go tell Steve and Christian about that?
Yeah.
If there's people out there. All right, sorry about that. We're always getting tourists here at our facilities, and I had just had a tour stop by. Anyway, so getting back to this here, I had a lot of experience working with the care of these plants. I ended up working here for over 10 years. This was essentially my summer job growing up. We had one greenhouse here that was filled with cucumbers, and we would turn this greenhouse over about every 8 or so weeks. The cucumbers would end up growing super fast, up to about 12 to 14 inches per day. You can see we kind of have two different stages. We've got the young plants in the front, and then more mature plants in the back. We kind of flip-flop back and forth. But all of this was on automated watering. So about every 10 or 15 minutes, our irrigation system would turn on, put a little bit of nutrient solution into each of the buckets, turn off, and that cycle would repeat over time. This is an example, same type of system in another greenhouse focused on tomato production. We had 3 large greenhouses with different types of tomatoes, beefsteak tomatoes, and cherry tomatoes as well. One of the nice things about these types of systems is we don't have the soil that we have to deal with, so there's no dirt anywhere. So we are able to maintain a lot cleaner conditions inside our greenhouses with these types of systems. You can just see the immense amount of fruit that we're able to push through these systems, because we're essentially able to optimize our nutrient solution, our recipes, and we're able to give plants their optimal conditions, essentially. So these are all grown in greenhouses. That's pretty typical of a lot of hydroponic production. Not typically grown outside. Usually it's in a greenhouse. You could do it indoors. A lot of people do it in garages or sheds or stuff like that. But then, of course, plants need light, so you have to do some supplemental light, and that's an added expense. You got to buy fixtures, you got to pay for electricity cost. So greenhouse growing tends to be the most cost-efficient method for this. We can take that one step further and combine hydroponics with aquaculture, and we get aquaponics. So this is where we essentially have a fish tank or multiple fish tanks connected to our plant system, and the waste that the fish produce, that is used as a nutrient source for the plants. So again, back in Wisconsin, I actually built my own aquaponics system and an aquaponics greenhouse in my parents' backyard. Bless their hearts, they were gracious enough to let me do that. But this is kind of a view of the system before there was any plants in it when I was first starting to build it. And then here is a picture once I had plants in it. So it is essentially a deep water culture system, but instead of adding chemical fertilizers to my system, the only input was fish food. So the fish eat the fish food, and they excrete waste into the water. And those wastes are converted by microbes, bacteria, naturally occurring bacteria that live in the water and on surfaces of certain tanks. And they convert those fish wastes into plant or available forms that the plants can use. So super common to grow, again, lettuce in these types of systems. And there's also people out there growing some other more conventional crops, such as cucumbers and tomatoes. So aquaponics was a really kind of a fun thing for me to work on. Ended up working on an undergraduate research project for that when I was at the University of Wisconsin, and then kind of got interested in that and decided to build my own system and own greenhouse here, and hopefully get that back up and running someday once I'm out of grad school. That'll be a fun thing. Oh, and here's kind of a picture from the other direction. You can kind of see the fish tank in there and the fish, a bunch of fish up at the top. This was right after I fed them. Tilapia fish are pretty common fish to be used in most types of systems. Fortunately, tilapia aren't necessarily legal everywhere, but other types of fish are used as well. Perch can be used, bass, bluegill, those are common types as well. In the back, instead of growing lettuce this year, I had grown some peppers. This was before I really learned a lot about plant growing, so I was able to grow beautiful pepper plants. Didn't really get any fruit off of them, but I was able to grow some really nice vegetative growth. So it was pretty fun to walk the greenhouse and see that. All right, I kind of want to finish here and wrap up with kind of some keys to success for anyone interested either developing their own hydroponic system or buying a kit. There's tons of kits out there. You can just go online and look at the various options out there, but kind of some of the things to look for, some of the things to keep in mind when you want to, if you want to get into some type of hydroponic production. One is that you want to promote light above, so in the leaves and the stems, and you want to block any light below in the root zone. So one of the biggest issues that people have with hydroponics is that they have gaps and stuff in the root zone, and light can get in there. Once you get light in there and you mix light and nutrients together, you have a huge susceptibility for algae. Algae doesn't necessarily affect the plant growth too much, but it's slimy, it doesn't look nice, it kind of grows everywhere, it makes things green, it can stain things. So if you try and seal up your root zone as much as you can to light, whether that's blocking it with some type of cover or putting some stones or something on top of a more solid media, anything you can do to block light from that root zone, right? Roots don't need light. So if you can block light, you can really decrease your algae and end up having a lot nicer looking and cleaner type of system. For that same reason, a lot of people have issues because they try and do small scales, maybe in their kitchen or in their garage, and they end up using clear containers or containers that, again, allow light to go through. And anytime you let light go through, you're going to get algae. So that's the biggest thing that I see. Conversely, right, the shoots of the plant, the upper parts of the plant need light. So a lot of people underestimate the amount of light that plants actually need. The amount of light that plants can handle, not necessarily need, but handle, is 50 to 100 times the amount of light that's actually in kind of like a standard room inside. So a lot of people end up not giving their plants enough light. And then they start to run into issues with either long leggy plants or slow growing plants. So supplemental LED lighting, this day and age, we have different types of LED lights everywhere. And we can use those to help increase our plant growth and make for some healthier plants. And then finally, feeding with dilute fertilizers. A lot of people tend to over fertilize. And not only is this a waste, but it can lead to some toxicity issues where you can get some confounding effects in your plants and they don't grow quite as healthily. So if you have a fertilizer and you buy a fertilizer, follow the directions on that fertilizer bag or fertilizer concentrate or whatever you're using. The directions are there and they're designed to give a proper nutrient solution. Don't double it or triple it. That's not going to do you any good. And for the most part, it's probably going to do you more harm than good. Then finally, I like to always leave with this quote that the best fertilizer is a farmer's footsteps. So hydroponic systems tend to be a little bit more involved than just a standard garden or a standard field agriculture. You can't necessarily walk away for 4 or 5 days and just kind of leave them to be. They need maintenance, not a lot of maintenance, but they need checking in on. It's a more involved type of production. And you need to kind of be checking in every day or so on how your plants are doing and how your systems are functioning. So don't neglect them. Keep on them, and you'll set yourself up for some good success. So I think I'll wrap up there, and we should have a little bit of time for questions. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to Melanie to moderate here.
Well, thank you so much, Noah. I really learned a lot. I'm going to let Maggie ask the questions from the Q&A, and then so please add questions if you have them, because if you don't, I've got a bunch of questions for Noah. So let's go ahead and get started.
I'll do my best to answer as good as I can.
Yeah, perfect. We got a few questions here for you. 2 of them are kind of dealing with the same thing, just kind of asking, compared to growing in the dirt, right? What's the comparison for pests? So like less to no pests when using hydroponic systems, and what are some of the pest issues that you deal with when you're growing using hydroponics?
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword almost. So you're eliminating the soil. A lot of pests and a lot of diseases are soil-borne. But when you transfer things inside, then we don't necessarily have the more beneficial pressures that can a lot of times keep those pests or keep those diseases in check. So it's kind of a difficult balancing act a lot of time. The easiest thing to do is to just try and keep your area as clean as possible. This doesn't necessarily mean spray bleach everywhere and sanitize. We don't particularly do that in any of our greenhouses here at USU. It's more just understanding good agricultural practices, making sure there's not piles of dirt or dust everywhere, making sure there's no random weeds growing in corners of your greenhouses that could end up harboring pests. And just for the most part, following good agricultural practices and not necessarily giving any diseases or pests the chance to enter. There's a lot of large commercial facilities out there that are super worried essentially about biosecurity. And they have double, triple entry doors and make you sanitize everything before you even go into a greenhouse. But it's kind of almost a similar thing where you can think about it with our immune system and antibiotics, right? If we try and flush everything out of our immune system, use a whole bunch of antibiotics, that almost opens us up to other types of issues. And it's similar with that, or with hydroponics. If you try and sanitize and sterilize everything, you're going to end up opening it up to other types of issues. So it's a delicate balancing act, but just following general good agricultural practices is kind of the best way to go.
Perfect. And then what sort of like electronic systems do you use to monitor like your temperature, the EC, the pH, and then kind of along with that, like what tomatoes work best with
Right,
hydroponics?
yeah. So that kind of depends on the system that you're using. So if you're using just straight liquid hydroponics, so there's no solid substrate there, those solutions tend to be a lot less buffered, which means the pH can swing a bit more. So those typically do require pH monitoring and pH control. You can do that manually. You can test the pH and add either an acid or a base as needed to adjust your pH, or you can have an upgraded automated control system. With solid types of substrates, whether that's perlite or coconut coir or mineral wool, those typically tend to be a lot more buffered, and pH control doesn't end up being too much of an issue. In terms of temperature control, we don't really control the temperature of our systems at all. We control the temperature of the environment. So if it's in a greenhouse, we have the greenhouse environmentally controlled, and that kind of dictates the temperature of our root zone or shoot zone.